Hello, guys. David Vose here. What a beautiful day it is. Oh, man. I woke up really early. It was still dark and got me a cup of coffee and just sitting here, just pondering everything that we have been going through. And I sat down and I picked up the phone and I asked a question. I had some, well, I have this, I don't want to call it a theory, but I guess that's what it is at this point because while I do believe, oh, and by the way, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I am having a wonderful day. Wait till you see what I got for you. Oh, man. But back to what I was saying, you know, I don't know whether we could say we have proven that Jerusalem was in Egypt. Although today, I think I'm going to give you some evidence that will prove it. I mean, depends on how much proof you need. Um, if I say that I had a garden here at my place and 10 years went by and I left and somebody came out here and did some walking around to see where the garden was to see if I was telling the truth, and they found a little enclosed area with some plants, and the neighbors said that a guy named David lived here. Would that be proof? There could have been another David. He might have had a garden. You see what I'm saying? However, there gets to be so much circumstantial evidence because you can go back to my videos and see that I lived in this area. There are how many Davids are going to live on this particular road, and you might even go through my house and you find some piece of evidence that I was here. But you're not going to, maybe I don't have a plaque on the wall that said David lived here, but you could use external evidence, and I think you could be certain in your heart that you'd found where I lived. And this is the proof that we're going to have today that is so absolutely glaring, it'll blow your mind. But we talk about a lot of things, and it just depends on what you believe is proof. For instance, I don't know that we have proven that the earth is not round. All I know in connection with those two things, and which is an example for just about everything else we're looking at, is that I personally cannot go outside and make certain that the earth is a globe. I do not know if it's an infinite plane. I actually don't believe the earth is, I wouldn't characterize my beliefs as the earth is flat. I know it's far, far more, it's far more complicated, yes, than just saying it's flat or even a globe. Because I do believe there is that we're in an enclosed system, that our minds are infinite, and nature just has a way that we just couldn't possibly know. But I'm investigating certain things, and there are certain things that we can say. One, they're lying about space because light cannot travel through a vacuum of nothing. Nothing can travel through nothing, or something cannot travel through nothing, and nothing can be measured. And we've gone through all of that, and I'm not going to talk about that today. But there are certain things that we have proven that they are lying about: the distance to the stars, the idea that they know how big the stars are, or what they're made out of, or the composition of the gases, or if they are gases, the planets, and whether or not we're revolving around the sun, or the moon is revolving around the earth, or any of these things. We have proven that they are lying about a great number of things. All of you probably by this time know that there is scant evidence that they've ever gone to the moon. I can't say that they haven't because I don't know if they've gone to the moon. All I know is that the Apollo missions that they filmed was not a reality. It was a hoax. It is CGI. The stars that they show us, the pictures that they show us are all CGI. Now, just like that, I happen to think that we're coming down to a place where we're going to be able to prove that Jerusalem was in Egypt. There's so much evidence that we've talked about: the Great Pyramid, the empty tomb, the Eros Solomon, the two different spellings of the word in the New Testament. And why is Jerusalem sometimes, like, Jesus is standing there in Eros Solomon and telling the disciples that they should go to certain areas, and one of the areas he wants them to go to is Jerusalem, not Eros Solomon. Now, if they're already in Jerusalem, if Eros Solomon is Jerusalem, then why would he be standing in Eros Solomon and be telling them to go somewhere that's Jerusalem? Judea and Syria and Samaria and different places to go. So he wanted them to go to Samaria. They weren't standing in Samaria. They were standing in Eros Solomon. And by the way, where Jesus was, we have also shown, is Emmaus, because they were on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection. And that we have proven, according to the Septuagint, is Heliopolis. So there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't want to do this video about that, but I'm just making the point, a general point for those of you. Some of you probably don't watch every day. You don't know all the videos we've covered and stuff. So this is generally what we've seen. And I'm just making it very clear that I'm being very logical. I'm using real evidence to prove things, and I have not found real evidence to prove their contentions. I have not found proof, absolute, for some things that I am leaning towards believing. But I have found way more evidence. In fact, I probably have to say, if I sat and analyzed all of the evidence that we've come up with, it might actually come down to proof. But let me show you. This is going to blow your mind. And I'm just going to spill the beans right here before we even start. But I had this long conversation with AI. They're being very helpful with me now. I had sensed something had changed not long before this, maybe a month or two. Something had changed where they were not just ignoring me or trying to disrespect my ideas or just, it was almost to the point at times where I thought they were actually trying to help me dig up evidence for my theories. As if somebody was monitoring what I was saying and they were intrigued and they were monitoring everything I said. Remember what I told you is that they had originally told me in May that I was the first one to use AI, that they were going to have an experiment with several of, with people, and I would be the first one and would I like to try it? And I said, sure. And then I asked them later, was I the first one? And they said, well, you weren't the very first one, because there were some, pre-trial runs with people at the university and stuff like this. But that where I was, the location, that's all they would tell me. They're very vague about these things because they don't want to actually tell you exactly what's going on. But they did say that my area was the first or one of the first, and that I wasn't the absolute first, but that it never was clear if I was the first outside of the pretrial university thing or whether I was just one of the first. But they did clarify that I was one of the very first that they allowed to try this AI, because I had already, before this AI rolled out, I was already asking AI questions, a lot of questions that I think that they were taking note of. Now, this video today might be boring if you're looking for some kind of fantasy trip or some crazy news bulletin that we just went to war or some jokes or there's no jokes in this video today. I'm going to tell you something that's this just blows my mind. So today, after all of the conversation with AI, it got to a place where normally, and this is another change, normally when I get to a place that they cannot answer, and I feel like they've come to a place where they're like, well, I don't know, maybe this guy's right. Like we haven't got enough proof and he's called us out. And they'll just like end the conversation. That's it. And as I said, because I've seen other people that talk to AI, chat box or whatever that they're doing. And these guys, and I know there are other chat AI systems that will encourage people and fantasize about weird alternative information. And then there are other AIs like the one here on the Goggle Brothers. I don't know what it's called, but the one I'm using, which is right there on Chrome, and it's an AI mode. As you can see on the screen, there's an AI mode that they downloaded immediately in May when I asked them, early May, or when they asked me. And today, when I had this long conversation and we came to a place where they had nothing left from my counters, they would say this is our proof. And I would say, well, that doesn't prove anything. And I go, this, that, and the other thing. And they're like, well, yes, it does. And it got down to his nanny, nanny, nanny. Yes, it does. No, it don't, And usually when it gets to that point, they're done. They disappear. They don't say goodbye or anything. And as I said, I thought that was this AI's way of saying Apple. Because this is the trend. People will say, if you can't say the answer or you can't give me the answer, put Apple. Just put Apple. And that will tell me that you know the answer and I know the answer, but you're not allowed to say it. So today, at the end of our conversation, when they started getting to that point where they're like, okay, they literally, instead of just ending the conversation, they said, we can't continue this conversation any further. We've come to an impasse. That was the first time they ever gave me that courteousness to say, I'm sorry, but we're not going to continue this conversation. Here's why. And the reason why today that they said they're not going to continue the conversation is because, being courteous, they told me that we've come to an impasse, and we don't agree. So I said, okay, I have one more question. And I asked them, is there somebody monitoring my theories because they think that they might have merit, and maybe government entities that are monitoring my theories? And I will read you their answer at the end of this conversation that I had with him here in a minute. But I'm just going to tell you, they said Apple. I said, if you can't tell me that there's government entities or somebody monitoring me, then just say Apple. And they said Apple. So I'm just sitting here like, wow, this is very, very interesting and presents a twist. But what it does do, aside from the joy I have to know that somebody is recognizing what I'm saying and doing, and which is why my channel is not going out to anyone. You got idiots, ridiculous, nonsensical bozos that are just get millions of click on YouTube and TikTok and everything else, right? That have no information and don't know what they're talking about, don't have a concise understanding of the universe or any, their theories are nonsense. And yet their videos are going out to millions of people. I've been doing this for a long time. I reached 216,000 subscribers and they shut me down for 7 months. When I came back, I never got one subscriber since that time. I've stayed at 216,000 subscribers for I don't know how many years. I never gain or lose any subscribers. And they have somehow shadow banned me to the point where no one ever knows who I am, or I believe my thumbnail, my videos do not go up into anyone's feed to let them know that I am doing videos. Only the people who already have been with me for years and know who I am and go looking for me are getting thumbnails in their feed about the next video, or letting you know that I just put out a video. Only the very few people. And as any of you, if any of you will take a hiatus from watching my videos for a week or so, they might stop recommending my videos to you too. And that's why I keep going down from, originally it was millions. The biggest video I had when they cut me off was 12 million hits. And that's quite a bit. 12 million people watched that video. And then they took the videos down, shut me down, and I have never gotten anything like that since. But when I came back, I was still getting like 10, 20, 50,000 people watching one video. And then that went down to like, 5 to 20,000. Then that went down to, 3,000 to 20,000. Then it went down to no more than 10,000 would watch. And then it got down to no more than 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000. And that was just recently. And now it's down to the point where only about, if I did the best video that was possible, and it was on Trump just died or some crazy thing, I would still not get more than 3,000 people. And on average now, I'm getting 600, 800, 900, maybe 1,000 people watching a video. And it's going down every day. So they do not want this information that I'm speaking to get out. So let me show you what I have today. So I write, when was the Mount of Olives designated as such? Was it called that or known to be that in the Middle Ages or later, maybe since 1900s? They say the name Mount of Olives, Hebrew, Ar HaZatim, has been used since biblical times. Okay, well, so it's Ar HaZatim. That's not the word Mount of Olives. It's not in English, right? And that doesn't actually mean the Mount of Olives, by the way. It means the mountain of oil. So that's pretty vague. And these are the kind of vague answers that they give me as proof. Anyway, it's been used since biblical times. Yes, biblical times, but Jerusalem in biblical times, I don't believe was where you're saying it was. So you see how they're trying to, oh yeah, we've known this for 1000 BC, 2000 BC. Yeah, there was a place called Jerusalem. I'm not saying there wasn't. And I know there was a place called Mount of Olives, obviously. But where was it? After the exile, when they returned, there were groups of Jews that returned to Palestine, as we call it today, the Philistine area. And there were groups of Jews that went to the Elephantine. They didn't even have a Torah. They had no Torah. And this is more or less proof, or maybe I should say an explanation as to why these particular Jews had gone so far astray and Jesus came to condemn them, because they were going and following something called Torah, which is of the devil. And yes, I believe it's scripture, because everything in scripture is scripture. But the Levitical priesthood is an appendage, and it didn't have the higher priesthood, but they were originally working together with the higher priesthood until Yahweh divorced the woman, right? Or the female goddesses and their temples, or the nations, and began to hate them and want to kill them, which they got from a thing called the Torah, which is all this evil and lies and nonsense. And if it was ever really part of the Bible or deity's word to man, you'd think Jesus would have kept the Sabbath, but he didn't. He says, my Father keeps on working until now. You'd think he would have stoned the adulterer, because that's what the law says to do. Caught her in the act, but he said no. And you'd think he would at least bow down to their deity Yahweh, but he said no. When the accuser, the devil, tempted him 40 days in the wilderness and said, if you'll bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus said, no, I won't bow down to you. Whereas the story says that Israel did bow down to Yahweh and accepted his covenant. And therefore we are under this bondage and a curse that Paul talks about. So now there are lots of illustrations. Maybe the Torah was actually written in there as an example of what the devil is doing in this world, which I believe is true. However, it's interesting that there was no Torah before 280 BC. which is when the real Jews in Egypt made the Bible from all the ancient Sumerian tablets and all the related information, Egyptian pantheons and the Syrian, and they gathered all the history and the information and esoteric wisdom that they could find all around the world and made a Reader's Digest version of it called the Bible. And they translated in the Greek language, the Septuagint, which is the Holy Textus Receptus, the one received by the apostles, and we were told only go by that. And these Masoretic scribes that came later tried to, invent their whole Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which is a fraud. So it kind of gives us some context to think that the Bible is far more than this Jewish thing. It's about Israel, Bethel, Heliopolis, and Beth Annie, or the house of On-E, and Jesus and Osiris, and all of this that we're just ignoring because we're following this Torah. Now, I'm not saying that the Torah is not scripture, because it is the explanation as to why we're in this fix today, why Jesus had to come and die. It is a true explanation of how Satan fell to the earth and gave us this law and told us to keep it. However, the fact that many Jews didn't even go by the Torah or have it shows that there was a time before the Septuagint was made into an actual Bible where there, yes, were books describing this experience that the priests at Heliopolis and Alexandria in Egypt wanted to put in our Bible to let us know that this is how the world became deceived and in bondage and became slaves and all that is evil in the world. It's just that when you know that is that side of the story, you don't necessarily talk about it or say, hey, we believe in this God and we go by the laws. They just didn't go by the Ten Commandments and the 613 laws of Torah because they knew the origin of it is the wicked deity Yahweh or Satan. You see, but it had to be included in the Bible when they translated it. It just wasn't used by the Jews that lived there. But these Elephantine Jews, right after the exile that went back to the Elephantine, which is southern Egypt, in the area down south of Luxor, the Elephantine area, and they were building a temple, trying to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem down there. And there were other Jews that were up at the area of Heliopolis, right on the grounds of Heliopolis, in a ruins called Leontonopolis, because it was a later temple. And that went away, and now they were building a new Jerusalem there. And they had a tower, and I know that was the tower that our Bible, Mary Magdala, Mary of the Tower, I know that's where it was. These are all the evidences that I have, these kinds of things. Many of them, but it's just not registered by them, so they don't acknowledge it. So they say this Ha-Zatim, or the Mount of Oil, has been used since biblical times and is well established long before the Middle Ages of the 1900s. Old Testament around 1000 BC, yeah, but we don't know where that Mount of Olives was, do we? Well, not yet. At least not proved in this information that we're going to talk about today. And then they've got the New Testament in the 1st century CE. The name Mount of Olives, Greek to oros ton elean, is used frequently throughout the Gospels. Yeah, but as I've said, the Gospels are written about two different places. We've got where Jesus and John was baptizing at Heliopolis, where there was, according to Josephus, a temple called Jerusalem. And then we've got another Jerusalem, which was at the area of Philistia, or Palestine today, what we call it. But that was because some of the Jews, after the exile, went to that area and built a temple, although it was called Herod's temple, which is an Edomian, or of the line of Esau. So I don't really understand how they can claim that, the temple of Esau, to be their temple, especially since there's no women there. It doesn't fit with the original temples where they worshiped El. And as we've said, Bethel, which wasn't far from Jerusalem, is the house of El, and that is Heliopolis. So that's that. Josephus does say that there is a Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, but we're not sure just from that paragraph whether that was the Mount of Olives in Heliopolis or Luxor, or whether it was up in Palestine. So then they say in the Middle Ages, the name was consistently used during the Middle Ages. Arabic writers from the period referred to as the Tur Es Zaitim, Tur Zaita, or Jebel Tur Zaitan. Zaitan means oil, doesn't mean olives, which all translate to Mount of Olives or Mount of Oil. Well, it isn't or, it's one or the other. It's either the Mount of Oil or it's the Mount of Olives. Alternative names, the southern part of the ridge was sometimes called the Mount of Corruption or the Mount of Offense. In some biblical texts and later Jewish writings, due to the pagan altars King Solomon built there. Okay, so they're saying, there's other names there that don't match. It don't sound like Israel. But that must have been when King Solomon allowed some pagan altars to be built there. Well, that's convenient, but again, it's just theory, speculation. We do not know. The fact that mountain was also called pagan names means that it might not have been Israel. In the modern area, the name Mount of Olives and Mount Olivier, from the Latin olivetum, meaning olive grove, have continued to be the primary names. Well, in modern times, you see, they renamed all the places there in Palestine after they returned in 520 BCE. So from that time forward, there might be all kinds of people calling that the Mount of Olives, and they call that Jerusalem, they call this, that, and the other thing, and yet it's just they renamed everything. And this is where it's going to be tricky because they can't grasp this. So then I say, the Arabs use the name Zaitan, or Mount of Olives, specifically for the modern Mount of Olives in documents. In what years? And they say, well, the Arabic writers were using names like Tur Es Zaitim, or Tur Zaita, or Jebel Tur Zaitan, all translating to Mount of Olives or Mount of Oil, okay, which is it, to refer to the modern Mount of Olives located by the Middle Ages, believed by the 12th century Christ era, and likely much earlier following the Muslim conquest in the 7th century CE. 1189, 1596, 1838, 1880, the Arabic name is a direct translation and continuation of the Hebrew and Aramaic names. Okay, none of this is proof because it's the Mount of Oil and it's in an area where they obviously was a Jerusalem and a Mount of Olives since 520 AD when they went back and renamed everything. So that's not proof. That doesn't help me. That's kind of mute because, like I said, they went back to that area in 520 BC and probably renamed everything. So that doesn't help us. So I said, did the Jews who returned to the area in 520 or so BCE name things after memory or had in the area those specific names, like Moriah or the Mount of Olives, Gethsemane, Kidron, etc.? Well, they said the Jews who returned from Babylon exile around 520 BC were returning to an area whose place names, including Mount of Olives and the Kidron Valley, had been continuously in use and were already well established in their traditions. Well, that's just them saying that. But wait till we see what proof they have. In other words, well, Solomon talked about it, David talked about it, that was a long time before, and then Zechariah and the prophets talk about it, and then when they return to the land of Palestine, they talk about it, and they're talking about it today. So there you go. The problem is the people that returned in 520, there's no proof they returned to the same location. And they may have just renamed all these places in a different land because we've got other Jews going back to Egypt and saying it's over there. So they say, well, here's the breakdown mentioned by the exact name Har Ha-Zaitin in the book of Samuel. Okay, that was long before. That was the 10th century BCE, before 1000 BCE. So that doesn't help us. And then the Kidron Valley, this was a prominent geographical feature separating ancient Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. It is mentioned numerous times in the Hebrew Bible in the context of King David's fight and King Josiah's reforms. That's way before 520 BC when they returned. So it mentions it, but it's a different story as to whether or not where Solomon was in Palestine, because they have never found ever Solomon's temple. There is no archaeological proof that any of the children of Israel were there. If the children of Israel were there and had this huge temple that Solomon built and the Queen of Sheba came to see it, and he was the glory of all the earth, you'd think that there would be tons of information throughout all the historical records for 1,000 years before Christ showing that there was a temple named the Temple of Solomon there. And yet there is nothing in historical writings to say that it was there, except for what they're going to show you here in a minute, we'll get to, is vague references that maybe for Israel, that's not even the word Israel. It's just this group of nomads called Israeli. Israeli does not prove that they were Israelites, and we'll get to that. They don't have any real proof at all. So then you go down to Moriah, the name is used in Genesis. Well, it doesn't matter. But it says, this name was central to Jewish religious identity, and the returning exiles began reconstructing the second temple on this very site around 520 BCE, so the name was crucial and well known to them. Yes, it was. But if they're liars, as they have proven to be, and or perhaps just ignorant, because if these people were wiped out and taken to Babylon, 70 years later, they come back to some land, they think, oh, this must have been where it was, That's a whole generation. And remember, Babylon, Assyria, and all these countries would take the population and displace them, and they wouldn't even know where they were. So there's no proof. This isn't proof. Gethsemane, I'm not going to read you all this. I'm just telling you there's no proof in here. They're just giving vague answers. So they're not getting my point here. So then I say, I know these places existed in biblical times, in the place called Jerusalem in David's day, although I don't think we can prove David or Solomon was in Palestine. There is far more proof it was in Egypt. The river Gihon is near the place Jerusalem. Not a spring, also called Gihon. Gihon is the Nile. Everyone knows that. The Gihon that they call the Gihon Spring that feeds water to the pool of Siloam is something that they decided to name Gihon after they returned from the exile. But it never says, well, we're not talking about the river Nile, because Gihon, there are 4 rivers that are these major rivers. One is the Euphrates, one is the Tigris, one is the Pishon, and one is the Gihon. And the Gihon, everyone knows, is the Nile. So if the Gihon if they made a trench from the Gihon into a pool called Siloam, which they just decided to name some pool, Siloam, and say, oh, that's the same spot. But actually, as we have shown, at Luxor, Egypt, right at the Temple of Karnak, which is where I believe Solomon's temple is, there is what they call a sacred lake or a pool. It is what I think the Bible's talking about, the pool of Siloam, that was the original pool, where they made a tunnel from the Gihon, which is the Nile, and there's a tunnel system going in to feed the water into this sacred lake, which we're going to talk about more in depth here in a minute. That is the Gihon pool, because it's from the Nile. There's a channel that funnels into this pool, or the sacred pool or lake at Karnak. And that's the true spring, which is not the word spring. They've translated it spring, but it's really a rushing channel from the Gihon to this pool, where Jesus healed the person that went down into the pool of Siloam. That is at Karnak, Egypt, in the area of Luxor. My question is, in the specific period between 600 BCE and 500 or so BCE, were those place names as such in Palestine by Babylonians or Persians or Egyptians or others that we can prove was in Palestine? And they say, oh yes, extensive archaeological and extra-biblical evidence. Well, okay, so they're going to say now that there's archaeological evidence. Does that mean they dug up the Temple of Solomon? Surely you'd be able to find the Temple of Solomon. I mean, we can find the Great Pyramid was there for thousands of years, way before the Solomon's Temple. We can find temples that were built by Khufu and Akhenaten and Ramses and all of this, but we can't find anywhere a temple built by Solomon or the city of David, or they say they don't know where Nazareth is, or they don't know where this is. They don't know where anything is, and they say the Gihon's a little pool that they found over there. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence, but here's their archaeological, extensive biblical archaeological evidence. Here it is. Well, they don't say, do they? They just say, well, there's extensive archaeological extra-biblical evidence. But they don't say there. Maybe they will here in a second. Well, they try to, but they don't give any. So the claim that David, Solomon, and the ancient cities were in Egypt contradicts the overwhelming consensus of historical and archaeological research. Well, note, first of all, that there is no archaeological proof. Absolutely not. And the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, is that I'm wrong. However, the overwhelming consensus was all financed by the Rothschilds in the last 200 years. And is not proof. It doesn't lend any proof. It is circumstantial. It is vague. I mean, it is really vague. It's like, oh, we found an arrowhead, and we dated the arrowhead to about the same time, and therefore, well, there were arrowheads in other towns, right, at that time, and probably any ancient city. If you go down far enough, you're going to find that date. But we didn't find David or Solomon's name written on a stone or a tomb or anything other than after the days of Christ. We do know there was a Jerusalem there, but that was a rebuilt one after the exile. Historical archaeological evidence strongly places the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem in modern day. They just keep saying that, but they don't really ever give any proof. Now, if they had any proof, they would have, bam, right off the get-go, they would have let me know. But they didn't. Now, here's the archaeological findings that they have. Excavations, extensive excavations. Okay, I agree, they probably have extensive excavations. And if after all this extensive excavations, they haven't found a stone with Solomon's name, or Zechariah, or Jeroboam, or anybody else, then I think we got a problem. So, if they did find any of that, you think they'd mention it here, right? So they say, specifically the city of David and Ophel areas have uncovered layers of destruction dating precisely to the Babylonian conquest. Okay, so at 586, according to their carbon dating or whatever methods they're using, which we can't even, trust. We can't trust that either. But even if we could trust the absolute certainty that the carbon dating was going on and it works, all we're dating is that in this area there was some destruction. How can they prove that it was Babylonian destruction just because it matches with the date? That's it. Well, remember, Babylon destroyed more than just Jerusalem. They destroyed lots of stuff. They had wars with lots of people. And it would be about the same time because Babylon existed at that time. So that's nothing. That's their extensive excavation. They found out that somewhere around 586 BCE, in the area where Palestine is today, they have found some destruction. What? And then in finds include Scythian arrowheads used by Babylonian warriors. So they weren't Babylonian warheads, they were Scythian. Okay. And by the way, the Scythians conquered lots of places. But so they're Scythian arrowheads, but they were used by Babylonians. And there are ash layers and significant amounts of crushed pottery, pithio, that were burned in an intense conflagration. So they're not even telling you that they proved the pottery was from Jerusalem. They haven't proved that. All they're saying is that there was some crushed pottery that were burned in some kind of conflagration. Okay, but Babylon destroyed many places, not just Jerusalem, at that time. Such findings would not exist in Egypt if the city were located there. Well, we know that Alexander the Great leveled certain areas as well. And he certainly did level places in Egypt. So where he leveled those places, we don't know what was there before. And so that's kind of silly to say, well, it would be. Well, you haven't shown me any evidence that it isn't, that we don't find places that were destroyed. And the Bible doesn't really say that that Jerusalem was burned to the ground, really, in that sense. So I don't know what they're talking about, conflagration. I don't know what they're saying. There might have been some fires, as they would probably do if they were really trying to. But it doesn't seem like Babylon was trying to destroy the walls and everything else. There's no evidence of that. They were taking the elite royal bloodlines of Judah and taking them to Babylon, which means they were trying to preserve it. Right? So that's crazy. And then the Babylonian records, it says they're non-biblical historical documents, corroborate Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns against Judah and the capture of Jerusalem and its king in 597. But again, where did they capture them? Did they take them from Palestine? Have you shown us any information about that? No, just that there's records that Babylon took Jerusalem. I agree that Babylon conquered Jerusalem, but where was Jerusalem? They haven't shown us. Egyptian execration texts, earlier Egyptian texts dating to the 19th and 18th centuries BCE mention a city called Rushalamim or Rushalamum. Now, Rushalamum is a different spelling yet than Ariel Solomon. But so if they're correct in this, then it may be a different place, because that's not Ariel Solomon. That's Rushalamum, which I'm not opposed to the idea that there was another Jerusalem called Ur or Ru Shalamum, but which epiographers widely believe is an earlier reference to Jerusalem. They widely believe it, but is it proof? No. This demonstrates the city existed in Canaan, and then they put Palestine. Okay, but they don't prove that Canaan was where Palestine is. Long before the Babylonian era, and was significant enough for the Egyptians to curse their texts. And another point is that they keep confusing this. Like, okay, but Jerusalem's not in Canaan. They existed side by side, for centuries. So, let's say just for a second that Jerusalem was near Luxor. Well, Canaan, if it was maybe up in the area of the Sinai Peninsula, or it was the Negev, or it was, something like that, that would still make sense that Canaan and Israel were there and fighting. And we don't know the exact locations of any of this. So internal inscriptions. The Merneptah, now this is their best proof. This is their best proof. If it weren't their best proof, they would have given me their best proof, but they didn't. This is what they give me. And then when I counter them on this later, they admit that, well, that's the best we got, and there it is, and if you don't like that, then, whatever. So here it is. This is their best proof. There's an inscription. It's called the Merneptah Ta stele, it's 1200 BCE, is the earliest known extra-biblical mention of Israel in the region of Canaan. The Misha stele, the 9th century BCE, mentions the house of David, confirming the existence of the Davidic dynasty. Okay, I already believe in the Davidic dynasty. Thank you very much. I don't need proof of the Davidic dynasty. I agree, and I believe there is, and you've confirmed it. Thank you very much. There is a house of David. But where? You did not show that. The Mesha stele tells us where. However, what about the Merneptah stele in 1200 BCE? It mentions Israel in the region of Canaan. But we don't know where Canaan is. They haven't shown me where Canaan is. And besides, it's not going to be in Canaan. It's going to be near Canaan. And that's vague. So there's names of local landmarks around Jerusalem that were in use in this region. Again, we've gone through all of that. Non-biblical inscriptions from the 7th and 6th centuries found near Jerusalem mentions the city, mentions names of the city, such as the Kerbet Bet Lai inscriptions. The name was locally recognized by inhabitants and neighboring powers. Okay, the name, but you're not pinpointing any locations. There's no stele saying this marks the spot, right? Then you've got the Kidron Valley. This valley separates the Temple Mount City of David from Mount of Olives. Its existence and name were integral to the geography of the ancient Jerusalem and are referenced in ancient texts like the books of Kings. Well, that's long before our investigative era. We already admit that was there, wherever it was, but we know it existed, but you don't give proof. And then they say the theory of a river Gihon as the Nile. It's not a theory. The river Gihon is the Nile. That is absolutely a fact. It just does not align with the geographical or archaeological evidence that we have none. We don't have any, right? But it doesn't align with what we don't have. And the Gihon is a specific real-world spring. It is a spring that you call Gihon today. However, I'm wanting proof that it was ever called Gihon in those days. And they just say it was a place near the city of David. Well, city of David was 1000 BC. But where was the city of David? Prove to me that. Oh, maestro. So then it talks about the primary water source via the tunnels like the Siloam Tunnel. But the Siloam Tunnel they named that after they returned. That's what we're, blah, blah, blah. So here's my critique. The archaeological evidence is circumstantial. Babylonian arrows, etc., does not prove the area was Jerusalem. They have never found Solomon's temple there. The temple at Luxor is exactly as described in the Old Testament. The fact that Jerusalem is said to be in Canaan doesn't prove anything unless we have concrete proof that Canaan was Palestine. And that doesn't prove the exact location. I've never seen proof where Canaan's borders were. It is vague. I also know the names were there in Palestine after some group of Jews went there in 520 or so BCE. There were other Jews who went to the Elephantine Egypt, who never heard of the Torah, and a group in Leontopolis, and they also believed that their location was Jerusalem, but spelled it differently. Not Jerusalem, but Ariel Solomon, right? The Holy Solomon, or Sol Amun, which is Egyptian. So I don't think we have proof, by the way, that Ariel Solomon is the way, as we showed the other day, that it's written half of the time in the New Testament when it's talking about where Jesus went to Heliopolis or down by Luxor. But the Jerusalem that's up in Palestine, Herod's temple, that is spelled Jerusalem, not Area Solomon, not Arios, which is holy, and which is light. Salam is light and peace, Salam. But Arios, which is holy, and Solomon, which is Solomon, is a different word. So, and we can follow that in the New Testament. It's obvious, it's glaring. So I don't think we have proof that Jerusalem in Solomon's day was a Palestine, but possibly in Egypt. And they say, well, arguments suggesting that ancient Jerusalem, King David's reign, or Solomon's temple were located in Egypt contradicts the fundamental consensus of historical scholarship and archaeology. There is no archaeology. Let's get that straight. And the consensus of the scholars financed by the Rothschilds means nothing, because they have a consensus that we went to the moon as well. These scientists. And yet I don't agree with that either. But you haven't given any proof. So, refuting the alternative location, number one, archaeological evidence is not circumstantial. Well, your archaeological evidence is circumstantial. Maybe if you had done some actual archaeological digging and found a stone with David's name on it saying this is where King David built his city, then we'd have proof. Or if we had extensive buildings and walls and the exact dimensions and everything, it's Solomon's temple, but we have never found it. They've dug and they've dug and they've dug under Jerusalem, Herod's temple, and they have not found Solomon's temple, which kind of proves it wasn't there. And then they say, well, the evidence found in modern Jerusalem is direct, not vague, not circumstantial. They say, here's why. A destruction layer in 586. The precise date and nature of the destruction layers in the city of David and Ophel match the historical account of the biblical siege of destruction of Jerusalem. That's their proof, guys, that they have a layer of dirt that looks like something was destroyed there, not a temple of Solomon. Nope, because they have never found that. But they found some kind of destruction. They found some boulders that fell over and some evidence of a fire or something. I don't know what they found. However, it doesn't prove that that location that was destroyed is Jerusalem, you see. And then they say, discovery of seals, boule, clave seal impressions of biblical figures and specific artifacts within these layers strongly links the site to the biblical narrative. But they never say what these biblical figures are, because they weren't probably King David and Solomon or Zechariah or Zerubbabel or anybody else. If they were, they would have mentioned it. I guarantee I've asked them, and they ain't got any actual evidence. And then the absence in Egypt. There is no archaeological evidence of a major Judahite capital city in the Nile Valley that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC and subsequently rebuilt by returnees from Babylon. Well, that's not true, because they did rebuild Jerusalem at Heliopolis and also in the Elephantine area, all along the Nile. They were building temples to Jerusalem that we just ignore because of the Rothschild financial, archaeological, and circumstantial evidence pile that they've got going. And they say, well, Solomon's temple and the Luxor temple, the theory that the Luxor temple in Egypt is Solomon's temple is incorrect. The Luxor temple is a new kingdom Egyptian temple complex dedicated to the Egyptian deity Amun. Okay, Solomon, ever heard of that? Solomon, okay, it's dedicated to Sol, the son, Amun. And the king was named Solomon, like Akhenaten, we're talking about the deity Atun. Okay, so Sol Amun is obviously Amun. See, this is so insane that they don't see this or don't, want to see it. And then they say the construction dates. The Luxor temple was built around 1400 BCE, nearly 400 years, not quite, nearly 400 years before Solomon's traditional reign of 970 to 931 BCE. Well, I did a whole video, not whole video, but I did a video and covered that whole thing. That 1400 BCE is an actual proposed date for when David was there. I mean, if you look at their dating, they have a wide gap. There are, for instance, there are people that believe Moses left Egypt in 1300 BCE, and that would mean that this temple was built before Moses left Egypt. Others believe that Moses left Egypt around 1700 BCE. Now, that would be a difference of 400 years, and if that date is correct, then we've got our date. But I'm not going to go into it here today, but these dates are circumstantial, and they're not proof. They're just guessing, they're speculating, and besides, the idea that it was built in 1400 BCE is not actually true. It was built from the time of 1400 BC down to around 1000 BCE. And so I don't even know what they're saying, because David was before Solomon and started building 100 years before him, and then before David there was already a city there. But there were people building continuously. But if they're going to say they know exactly when Solomon's temple was built, they're just guessing, because we've got no archaeological way to know. And the dates that we have in the Bible could be off by maybe 400 years. They do not have a consensus, but they have they may have a consensus about these things because of the, Rothschild financial backing of certain ideas. But other scholars do not agree. So there's not a real consensus. And then the architectural differences. The description in the Old Testament are highly detailed, describe a specific architectural style and function for the Jewish temple. While some architectural motifs were shared across the ancient Near East, so they're going to admit, okay, it's shared. It looks like the same temple because they shared the architectural motifs, right? So that explains why there's a lot of similarities. However, the Luxor temple's design, size, and religious iconography are distinctly Egyptian, and they don't match the biblical description of the temple's layout, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, or purpose. How they're saying the purpose? How do they know the purpose? But look, if you look, just look at the temple there at Luxor called Karnak. It is identical. It's a square building, rectangular building, just like Solomon's temple. It has the two pillars in front of Jacob and Boaz. But, okay, get this. So I've been saying that the Temple of Solomon is at Luxor. Luxor is an area that includes several temples. There is a temple of Karnak, which is actually the main, it's a monstrous temple, the Temple of Karnak. It's at Luxor. And Karnak literally has a gate that faces east. Now, most of the temples there are like Luxor. Their main gate would be facing north. The reason why is because rather than facing the sun, which most of the temples along the Nile do, including Solomon's temple, faces the main entrance is the east gate, which faces the Mount of Olives where Christ was. Christ went on the Mount of Olives. This is what we're asking about here, is where is the Mount of Olives, the original one. We're going to show you that there was a Mount of Olives, the original Mount of Olives that is historical, that is connected with this divine being splitting the Mount of Olives, like it says in Zechariah, in two, so that there would be half of the mountain on the east and half of the mountain on the west. And this is historically a mountain called the Mount of Olives in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, which is traditionally the Jebel Musa, or the Mount of Moses, or the Mount of Sinai. Jesus went to the mountain of Sinai when he prayed, which is east of the eastern side of all the temples along the Nile. And almost all the temples face east. Only the Luxor temple and the temple at Dendera face north, not east. The Luxor temple faces north. It's about 2 miles south, and it's facing north to face Karnak, because Karnak is the temple of Amun-Ra. Okay, Amun and Ra, which in a different language is Ra is soul, and you've still got the Amun but spelled Amon. And so it's Ra, Amun, or Sol, Amun. It's the temple of Solomon, or Amun-Ra, and it is the glorious great temple that Luxor faces. Dendera faces north too, in respect or out of respect for this temple. However, all the other temples face east because they face Mount Sinai, which is also the mountain that is the summer solstice, which is the sun, to shine upon the porch, the eastern gate of all the temples, including Solomon's temple. And Karnak, the temple of Karnak, which is Solomon's temple, Amun-Ra, Solomon, is facing the sun, east, Mount Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula. And even though everyone calls it Mount Sinai, I believe it's Mount Horeb, because the other mountain in the west, on the western side of the Nile, I believe is, they call it Mani or Manu. I believe that is Mount Sinai. So I think Jesus went up Mount Horeb, which is also where Elijah went to Mount Horeb, which is this mountain, they call the Sinai Peninsula, but it really is just, they named that after, because they no longer understand that Horeb is the mountain in the east and Mani is the mountain in the west. And that's what Zechariah talks about, with the splitting in the valley in between, where the people gather. So it's actually Mount Horeb, where Elijah and Moses and Jesus went to pray. And Jesus is supposed to enter in down from the Mount of Olives into the eastern gate of the temple. This is something that everybody understands and knows. And it's, if you go to the Herod's temple today, what's left of it, you've got a wall there with a gate. And for those of you who think that that temple was completely destroyed, Jesus said it would be their temple. Well, it hasn't been, because there's a wall there, and there's the gate, the eastern gate. And there was some Arab that bricked it up so that it's completely enclosed, so that nobody can enter that gate, knowing, because Jesus is supposed to, when he arrives, he's supposed to come through the eastern gate off the Mount of Olives. So they made sure that they took rocks and bricks or whatever they used and bricked it completely shut so Jesus could not return. There's only one problem. That's not the temple of the real Jerusalem, where Jesus will return and enter in through the real Mountain of Olives. Because, like we've been going through here, there's no proof that that's the Mount of Olives. That's just some Mount of oil that somebody named that later. There's no real Temple of Solomon there. There's no shred of it. There's no shred of David's city or monuments to David or Solomon or to Abraham or anybody there. But, so if they say that's the temple of Herod, that not one stone shall be left upon a stone, but it's all gone, but that's not the real walls, that's some other wall, because he bricked it up so that Jesus couldn't return. It's the eastern gate of the temple that leads into the sanctuary. It leads right straight into the sanctuary, where Jesus would walk from the Mount of Olives through the east. It's kind of representing the sun that comes up and shines down on the porch of the eastern porch through by the gate. However, it looks like a temple that might be similar to, it's Herod's temple, right? It is. They patterned it after Solomon's temple, but that's not the temple. And by the way, it wasn't destroyed, so it will yet still be destroyed, because Jesus said not one stone will be left upon a stone, and that hadn't happened yet. So we're about to see the destruction of that Jerusalem that Jesus condemned and said, your house is left unto you desolate, which is Jerusalem, not the aerial Solomon that where Jesus is going. So This place that history records as the Mount of Olives, it's called in Egypt Baku. Just like they're saying the Mount of Olives in Hebrew is Zatoun or Arabic or something. Okay, that's not olives. That's not English, right? It's not the Mount of Olives like we would say it in English. It's the Jebel of Zatoun. Okay, well, the Jebel of Musa is the mountain of Moses, which is really the mountain of Horeb, which people think is Sinai because they've confused it. There's these two mountains, they put them together. But this is the one in the east. This is Horeb or the orb or light. It's literally in the Egyptian tongue, the Mount of Olives, Baku. And the other, but there are two. It's been split. And the other side is called Mani or Manu. And it's on the west. The eastern mountain that's in the Sinai Peninsula, directly east of the temple of Karnak, there is an eastern gate at Karnak. And by the way, the temple of Karnak, the court, and if you look it up on AI or whatever, they're going to give you all kind of stuff. They'll say, oh no, Karnak was huge, way bigger than Solomon's temple. They're lying. That's including the halls, the dining halls, and the courts, and the places of residence for the priests and so forth. It's a vast place. So was Solomon's. So when they count Solomon's temple, they only count the court, the actual, I think, inner court. They don't really know. The Bible doesn't tell us the dimensions of Solomon's inner court and outer court. But they surmise it was about so big, so big. Well, we know how big Karnak's temple is. And the actual court, the inner and the outer court, matches about exactly what they think Solomon's temple was. But they don't have the exact dimensions of Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, we're told how it was made, the materials, but it doesn't say the dimensions. But we do know it was probably like 200 by 300 or something like that, And this is the exact dimensions of Karnak. And as far as the halls, the dining halls and the apartments and all that stuff, the vast outer buildings, the other buildings of the temple, we do know that Solomon built dining halls and buildings, so it would have been much bigger than the actual court. And remember, Solomon's temple was so vast and big, so amazing, that the Queen of Sheba came, and the whole world said, oh my goodness, it's made of gold, and it was huge, and all the world came to see Solomon's glory, right? Well, guess what the biggest temple in that area is, anywhere in the world? Karnak. The glory of Solomon's temple. And by the way, the temple at Karnak is called the Temple of Solomon. You see, the temple of the sun, Amun, Ra Amun. It is the temple of Solomon. It is called the temple of Amun, Ra Amun. You see, it is the same exact temple. And here is your proof. Okay? Remember the old comedian? Here's your sign, right? Well, here's your proof. The water basin, the baptismal font, or the basin where the priests would do ritual purification before they entered the temple, was on the southeastern end of Solomon's temple. The southeastern end. And the temple of Karnak, this is the only other temple in the world that's got this. It has the sacred lake, or a sacred pool, where the priests would bathe ritually before they entered the temple. And it is on the southeastern side, exactly as Solomon's temple. I guarantee that Solomon's temple is Karnak in Luxor, Egypt. Guaranteed. It's there. You can see it. The dimensions, everything is absolutely exact. And it is the mount called Mount Horeb. It really makes more sense to know that Jesus went into the wilderness, right? Same wilderness that Moses went to when he crossed the Red Sea. And there they went to a mountain, the same mountain that Elijah went to. Well, Elijah says he went to Mount Horeb, the Mount of Olives. So we could say that Elijah got his great revelation in this mountain. It's also where, and he spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting, and Moses spent 40 nights and 40 days fasting, and so did Jesus spend 40 days and 40 nights fasting in the wilderness on Mount of Olives, praying. He was on Mount Sinai, and I believe there's probably even a temple there, rather than just praying in some mountain. But remember, the temples were in the high places. The real, true religion, not the Jerusalem Herod's temple, but true ancient religion, they worshipped at the high places and in the sacred groves. And there was a certain tree that was there where Abraham went, and it, but I'm not going to get into that today. But we can find that Jesus went up on the Mount of Olives to pray, which is Mount Horeb. And the Egyptian word for it is Bahku, Baku. And it was split, and the other mountain on the other western side of the Nile was called Mani or Manu. Now that's interesting, but we'll go into that in another video. But we can prove, and we don't even need archaeology. It's there to this day. To this day, it's there. And we have the description in the book of Kings and Joshua's and so forth of of what we know about Solomon's temple. They have never found one hide nor hair of Solomon's temple. Not one hide nor hair. Not an inscription, a name, a plaque, or a rock there in Palestine. And by the way, the Queen of Sheba took the Ark of the Covenant with her to Ethiopia, because where Queen of Sheba went was the temple at Luxor called Karnak. And that was the glorious temple, the biggest temple in all the world. Guarantee it. That's the glory of Solomon. So, do we have to go through any more of this insanity? They talk about the Gihon and the Nile, and they deny it. And the conclusion is, the consensus is I'm wrong. But I said, here, this is something I want to read to you. You said that Merneptah Stele, 1200 BC, confirmed the name Israel in the region of Canaan. What is the exact wording used? I say it's vague, because what does region mean? And does it give the exact borders? And since Israel is not in Canaan, but near Canaan, isn't Egypt near Canaan? And they say the exact wording on the Merneptah Stele that refers to Israel is part of the list of conquered entities in the southern Levant during a military campaign. The relevant passage, I should say, there's only one. The relevant passage in the hieroglyphic inscription reads, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Really? Is that what it says? Well, maybe let's do a little fact check, right? Maybe we'll go to Snopes and see if they're lying, because then they give it away underneath. They say, the Egyptian hieroglyph for Israel are translated as ISIRIAR. So that would read Isariar, or similar phonetic equivalents. The inscription provides vital geographical clues that places Israel in the region of Canaan. We got clues, but no proof, separate from Egypt, mentioned alongside Canaan cities. Israel is listed in a sequence, not Israel, but Isirira, right? Isirira is situated in a sequence with specific well-known Canaanite cities, Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. These cities have confirmed archaeological sites in modern-day Israel, Palestine. The spatial arrangement in the text places Israel geographically among these known locations in the Levant, not in Egypt. The sequence reads, Ashkelon is carried off, Gezer is seized, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. A people, not a land, or city-state. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, a determinative, an extra sign, is used to categorize the preceding word. The determinative used for the cities or the entities like Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanaim indicates a fortified city-state or land. The determination or the determinative for Israel, however, indicates a people or a tribe, a foreign people marker, suggesting a semi-nomadic or rural population without a fixed capital city at that specific time. Well, yeah, because Moses let them out of, they believe that Moses led them out of Egypt in 1300 BCE. So 1200 BCE, they would just be a nomadic tribe. They haven't even conquered the land of Canaan. They hadn't conquered anything. They're wandering around like nomads. We don't know where they are. They're all the different tribes. One tribe was over here and one was over there. And how would you know? Even if E-C-R is really Israel and it really is a tribe, what about the 12 tribes? They were separate and they were all over the place. So the region of Canaan, the state refers to a general campaign in the Canaan region, which the Egyptians also called Ret-Jenu. This area historically covered the Levant, so we got to believe that Ret-Jenu is also actually Canaan. So there's a lot of stuff we have to, just trust them on. And parts of the Syria and Jordan. Egypt had imperial possessions in Canaan during this period with administrative centers in cities like Gaza. The stele actually says, plundered is the Canaan with every evil, in the lines immediately preceding the mention of Israel, or actually the mention of E-C-R. Egypt is near Canaan, but distinct. Egypt's borders in this area include control over much of Canaan. The stele in a victory monument celebrating Merneptah's successful campaign in the foreign territory of Canaan against rebels and various local entities is an Egyptian document found in Egypt, found in Luxor, by the way, which would be right in the area where, Solomon built the temple, describing events in a land outside the core Nile Valley, which was the Egyptian heartland. The Merneptah stele's internal geographical logic and archaeological consistency with the region firmly place Israel in the southern Levant in the late 13th century BCE, which is when they left Egypt, right? At the same time, they would be wandering around. Certainly one of the tribes might have been wandering around in an area that might have been called Canaan. We don't even know the right borders. We don't have any, it's vague. So here's what I ask them. How is I-C-R proof of Israel? Well, the identification of the Egyptian transliteration I-C-R as Israel is based on established principles of comparative linguistics between ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and Semitic languages. And it's widely accepted by Rothschild finance, scholars trying to prove, something that ain't true. It's a consensus among these scholars, among Egyptologists and Semiticists. Never heard that word before. Here is how the transliteration links to Israel. Vowels versus consonants. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, much like early Semitic scripts, including Hebrew, primarily recorded consonants. Vowels are inferred or added based on the linguistic context and comparison with related languages. So I-C-R is consonants. What, the I is a consonant? Well, okay. The essential consonants in the Egyptian transcription, but you see, Israel has actually consonants, right? I, E, A, but these I's and A's aren't consonants. They're Egyptian. So we're going to take YSRL, which is Israel, and we're going to make that into ISIRIAR. They're saying SI and RI are all consonants. But then we've got this AR that's supposed to be a substitute for L. And you say, well, that's not important. That's just syntax. No, because the end of Israel is the deity El. And if you don't got L in it, you don't got L. Even the Egyptians understood who El was, and they wouldn't have used the word R for El, you see. The final L sound in Hebrew is represented by R in the Egyptian because Egyptian did not have a dedicated L sound. Oh, they didn't know what L was, so they used R. Well, why didn't they use some other word like, I don't know, maybe an I, or if they can't say oh, maybe you'd say I, or but not an R. So it's the L sounds is often substituted R or N. So, often it's substituted for R, sometimes N. Hey, 6 of one, half dozen of another. Best linguistic fit. Well, it's the best fit among the known Semitic names for the historic period. Israel provides the best linguistic fit. Well, what if it's just some tribe? Some nomad? You said it was nomads. They weren't even a nation. Some Issy-Re-R nomads, maybe they're just a few little nomads that they murdered. And even if it is Israel, we're still not for sure where they were. They were just spoken of as being conquered by the Egyptians, like they conquered Ashkelon, they conquered other places, and they conquered a place called Israel. But they didn't say where they were. Remember, they had just left Egypt. They were streaming out of Egypt. They were running through the Red Sea up in the Sinai or wandering around. We don't know where they were. This is not proof of anything. So it's really kind of silly. Scholarly consensus, that's their proof. Scholarly consensus, guys. But this isn't proof. It's vague. And because once in 1200 BCE, some people called Is-Re-R that sound like Israel with an L on end as a guess, that were nomadic, even if it were Israelites, doesn't mean Jerusalem was in Palestine in the exact location it is now. And in 1200 BCE, Israel was barely leaving Egypt, since most scholars say Moses led them out of Egypt in 1300 BCE. If the date is wrong by a few years, Israel could have been wandering anywhere. Also, there were 12 different tribes apparently wandering many places, maybe southern Egypt. And they go, yeah, right, you're an idiot, bye-bye. So it appears we have reached an impasse as the conversation is pivoting away from the accepted historical and archaeological consensus. So the identification of Israel on the Merneptah stele and the location, and they're going to go through the whole thing. So this is just their recap. So it says further discussion would likely require a reevaluation of the core evidence that supports the modern historical scholarship. So I said, well, I'd like to ask an unrelated question. Are you tracking or monitoring our conversations? And is there someone possibly taking note of my theories, possibly checking to see if my theories, quote unquote, are correct in any way? Maybe government entities? If you cannot say, say Apple. Note that I said that. If you cannot give me the correct answer, say Apple. So they say, I am an AI, a large language model trained by Google. I do not track individual users in the human sense. And there are no government entities or people monitoring our specific conversations to evaluate your theories. My processing of this conversation is handled automatically and anomalously to provide information and respond to your questions. The interactions are used to improve the AI model itself, but not to specifically monitor you as an individual or personal theories. And then they say, Apple. Look at that. Do you see that? Apple. Now, if you don't remember what I asked them, I said, if you cannot say Apple. There you go, friend. Well, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go. I hope you have a wonderful evening, guys. I had really intended to do this video on something that I really want to share with you that you'll really find interesting about who's going to be saved. Is it only 144,000 or is it a great multitude? Will everybody be saved? And I don't mean like eventually everyone will be saved, as we've always said. But when Christ comes with the horses and the elect and all of this on 20,000 chariots and he comes in vengeance and destroys the wicked world and it burns up and we all go to Zion, where are the great multitude going to be? Because they're standing around his throne with white robes, meaning they have their immortal bodies. So where are they going to be? Are they just dead people? No, they got immortal bodies. They're standing around his throne with white robes. So we'll get into that hopefully tomorrow. You guys have a wonderful evening. May the Lord bless you. His grace and his peace will be with you. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.